We have quite a number of questions, and I will do my best to give attention to as many of them as we can. These two questions deal with the media, and you did mention a little bit about that in terms of instant communication. This person wants to know, as the internet and 24-hour news entertainment networks have made fact-checking, and this is in quotes, irrelevant, how can we expect honest discussion based on facts and issues upon which our democracy relies? And then the second, how, and I would presume this person is referring to collegiality, how has the media contributed to the problem?
Thank you for that question, and that's another component to the answer of the previous question. Because it used to be, as the country developed, that even though back in the beginning of the country they had their own partisan papers, but things were a lot slower back then in communication. As you developed on into the early part of the last century, newspapers, devices to share news, were the filters for incorrect information not getting out. And thus, our papers here, some of the best papers in the country, they were doing the fact-checking. They wouldn't run a story unless they had two people corroborate. This is what they were teaching our students in journalism school. You see how that's changed? Now, anybody can put something up on a blog. Somebody can take something from a cell phone camera, put it up on any of the new media, and all of a sudden it may explode into the mainstream media and have never been fact-checked. That also tends to divide us, because when you can't deal from relevant, correct information, it's hard to get people to come together to build consensus to govern. Now, what was the second part of the question?
The second part of the question was, has the media contributed to the problem? And then, as the internet and 24-hour entertainment networks have they made fact-checking irrelevant?
And the answer would be, certainly it's contributed to it, just in the way we just described.
Looks like we'll have time for about 2 more questions, Senator. And several people have asked questions about the deficit, taxes, jobs. So we'll try to sum this up with a couple of questions. This is one on taxes. Do you feel that Warren Buffett's input on taxes will have any sort of impact?
By the way, after my op-ed piece appeared in a couple of publications, out of the blue, I got a letter from Warren Buffett. And he said, this is exactly what we need to do, what I've described to you today. Now, the question is about Warren Buffett and his proposals for tax reform.
His
input
right.
on taxes. Well, yes. You know, what he says is, and this is his famous line that every one of us ought to understand, why should he pay the same tax rate that his secretary does? Why? No, he says it even worse. Why should his secretary pay more of a higher percentage tax rate on her income than he does? And I think it's a legitimate question. Do we have a progressive tax system or not? Well, you know why he doesn't? And he says, that's why he wrote me that letter. Because of all these tax preferences, these loopholes that allow basically the General Electric company that's making millions and millions of dollars to pay 0 tax in the last tax year. It's an example of how the tax code is so riddled with these loopholes. We need to change it.
Thank you. And the last question for you, Senator. What was the best thing about being in space?
Well, I'll make my answer short because, of course, I'd love to go on. But, well, for the students, I'll tell you, Zero G is an extraordinary environment. And of course, I wanted to fly like Superman, so I got off on one side of the spacecraft and stuck out my arms and pushed off. And of course, you have to reprogram your brain because you're in a totally different zero G environment. I way overcompensated. I went sailing so fast, I crashed into the wall. Zero G, I also remember every minute is planned. And so at the end of a flight day, the crew's pretty tired. And one of our members just fell asleep, and he was floating. Now, most people would sleep by sailing into a sleeping bag that you would attach to something. Our commander and pilot sat just in their seats in case of an emergency. But this member, he was just floating around. And I was the last one to sail into the sack, and I noticed the air conditioning currents were pushing him toward me, and I thought, well, he's going to keep bumping into me. I've got to fix this. So I sailed out, I went over to the locker and took out a piece of gray sticky tape. And I floated over to him, and I put one end of that tape around a wire that was coming out of his flight suit. And then I very gently floated him across the cabin and stuck him to the wall. And that's where he woke up the next day. Thank you all.
Thank you. We'd ask now that the Palm Beach State College students come